We turn now to Jefferson City, where the Missouri Senate could soon consider a plan to legalize sports betting. Senator Bill Eigel is now on the record. Senator, the Cardinals are about to have opening day this week. At this time next year, can Cardinals fans go up to the window and place a wager?
We've yet to see what that's going to look like. I know that's probably going to come up in debate over. Sorry, we're having a visit from Frankie the dog. Frankie's a
Oh,
foster dog.
Frankie's helping the ratings already.
Yeah, sorry about that. But we do expect to have that conversation in the Missouri Senate over the next few weeks. I don't know what that ultimately will look like in terms of what's going to come out or what may not come out of. But there is a lot of folks following this issue, and we're going to take a good close look at it.
Give us a better idea where you stand on the issue. What are you looking for? What are your concerns? What would it take for you to support the bill?
Well, I'll tell you, if you look at the GOP platform, it's pretty clear on an expansion of gambling. We generally don't support expansions of gambling in the state of Missouri. Now, the sports betting is something that's been talked about for a while. So I'm going to be looking at if we're going to consider something like this, what are the funds going to be used for? I mean, the reality is the state already has enough money. So we don't have to expand gambling in order to make more money for the state because we've never had so much money at the state level. So I'm going to take a look at that. We have a lot of needs still in our veterans programs and in some other areas. So we'll take a close look at that, but I haven't made up my mind yet.
Switching gears from the State House to the campaign trail for a bit, what kind of a governor would Jay Ashcroft make?
Well, I tell you what, if his record is any indication, I think I would have a lot of concerns. And if I thought he would be a great governor, I probably wouldn't be considering running from governor myself. And, Jay is a guy that he's a nice guy, he's a Christian man, but the reality is I think he's made a lot of errors in his time as Secretary of State. Here's a guy that has called for the sale of Missouri farmland to foreign entities. In fact, specifically, he's endorsed a plan that would allow 135,000 acres of Missouri farmland to be sold overseas to foreign entities. And I think it's a bad idea to let other countries control your food supply. He's also the guy that was in charge of our elections. And when he was entrusted by the state code and the people of the state to reject certain measures from the ballot before they got in front of the voters, for example, Amendment 3, which was a violation of the single subject clause of the Constitution. The Clean Missouri initiatives were a violation. Jay should have acted. He didn't do that. And now we have some things in our Constitution that were put forth by very dishonest out-of-state special interests that wanted to lie to the people of Missouri to get into our Constitution. So I think that what we need in this state is a leader that is going to be bold and courageous about implementing policies in this state that are going to put us on par with the Floridas and Texas of the world. Don't get me wrong. I love those states and they're doing great things, but I'm tired of turning on my TV at night and hearing about Ron DeSantis and all the things that he's doing down there in Florida that we're not doing here in the state of Missouri. We elect more Republicans to our state legislature than all of those states that are doing better us right now. And the reason is because we have a status quo in this state that's preventing real conservative reforms from moving forward. And, Jay Ashcroft and Mike Kehoe, they are that status quo. So I think we need a different path.
Just to put a pin on that for our audience who might be listening and wondering about Amendment 3, it sounds like what you just said, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you were Secretary of State, you would have taken action to block Amendment 3, even though the will of the voters was to legalize marijuana in Missouri. Is that right?
Well, so under Section 116.120 of the state code, the Secretary of State has the authority to reject any measure from the ballot that violates the single subject clause of the Constitution. So, of course, if you're going to ask the voters a question, you can only ask them one subject at a time so that they can give you an answer. Well, Amendment 3 had at least a dozen different subjects, and it included 38 pages and 50,000 words of code that no sensible person could look at a 100-word ballot summary and make a decision on. The Supreme Court has ruled that the Secretary of State can and should reject those from the ballot back in the early 1990s, and that was upheld by the Attorney General. And yet, when it came time to do so, Jay Ashcroft did nothing, and it got onto the ballot. And I think a lot of folks are now looking at those kind of decisions and those failures to act as a reason why, I don't know if Jay deserves a promotion, but that is precisely why I'm putting together a campaign, because I think we deserve a lot better than that.
And how did you vote, and would you legalize marijuana if it wasn't in the Constitution? Would you do it through statute?
So I haven't been a fan of expanding the role of drugs, and the reason is it if you look at the legalized drugs that we have in the state right now, whether it's alcohol, whether it's tobacco, we don't do a good job keeping those drugs out of the hand of underage folks. Now, Amendment 3 did have a provision in there where it said you couldn't get those, those under 18 couldn't take part in that, but we don't have good protections for alcohol and tobacco, keeping those out of the hands of kids. So until we see those, I wanted to see a lot more progress there before we expanded further. So I was a no when I went into the ballot box. We're going to continue to work under the purviews of what our Constitution says at this point. So we're going to do what we can to try to keep people safe. But this would have been a much more straightforward conversation if Jay Ashcroft had done his job.
All right, you just said a minute ago that you want to emulate Florida. Red flag laws might have taken the AR-15 and 600 rounds of ammo out of the hands of the St. Louis school shooter, but you have a bill that would effectively put that gun back in his hands if it banned red flag laws. My question is this: if red flag laws are good enough for Ron DeSantis in Florida, and they're good enough for Mike Pence in Indiana, why aren't they good enough for Bill Eigel in Missouri?
Well, because quite frankly, focusing the conversation on different ways to restrict gun ownership from law-abiding citizens is not a path that we want for success. Missouri has a pretty long history in its defense of the Second Amendment. In fact, we've been leading the country. This is an area we have been leading the country on how we're going to defend people's rights. We passed the Second Amendment Preservation Act, and rolling that back and eating around the edges of those protections by opening the door for the establishment government to come in and seize firearms outside the normal process through these red flag databases and red flag laws. I think that's a distraction for the things that are causing crime, whether it's in the city of St. Louis or around the state, and gets us away from taking action that we need to take in order to make sure that we're not only going to not see crime in those areas, we're going to continue to see economic opportunity grow in those areas.
Even though many of these people are accused of domestic abuse or worse types of violence, police in Florida say that they're working extremely well to take guns out of the hands of dangerous people who mean serious harm to others. How does that testimony from law enforcement shade your thinking in any way?
Well, I think I've seen a lot of testimony from individuals that have exercised their Second Amendment rights to be protected in scenarios where the police were unable to respond fast enough. So I'm going to side on this. I'm going to fall on the side of folks that want to be able to legally carry firearms, and that's what we're seeing here when we talk about these protections. Now, there has been a tremendous move by the folks in the city of St. Louis to say that the problem is not their terrible economic and security policies down there, that it actually has something to do with law-abiding citizens. I mean, and many of these policies that we see come out, whether it's red flag laws or restrictions on the Second Amendment or gun-free zones, simply don't work. And so I don't want the conversation to shift away from policies that actually will reduce crime, whether it's not defunding our police, whether it's taking measures to empower our police officers and our criminal court system to put criminals in jail, versus going down this path that thinking that somehow guns themselves are the problem and the humans behind them are somehow not responsible.
And in just the last minute we have left here before we let you go, I want to end the program where we began it with Senator Holly Thompson Rader here. Why was this transgender restriction for minors such a priority now? If you talked about the GOP caucus agenda and priorities earlier, why was this so high on the list?
Because our mission, I've always defined the role of government to protect the rights of its citizens, and that among these rights, we should be protecting the most vulnerable of our citizens. Here's the reality when it comes to these transgender procedures for kids. It's not a medical procedure. It is, in fact, a mutilation and a barbaric procedure that's being inflicted upon children that we should be ashamed of, that we have in our society. So the bill was this was never a conversation about social identification. It was a conversation about protecting kids. Missouri is already not the first state that has enacted these kind of protections for kids. But today we made sure that we were standing up for children in the state. And if we can't stand up and protect the most vulnerable kids and citizens of our state, then there's not much use to having any of us down in Jefferson City.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're running out of time. Senator Eigel running for governor in 2024. I imagine we will hear and see a lot more of you throughout the next year and a half or so.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.